Very good. Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's nice to be here with the development of my PhD thesis. I am 1 year away from defending my thesis, so I have come to the part where I needed to shape my methodology. And the idea here, just a moment. I don't know if you remember, but last year I presented the beginning of this idea with based on Spinoza. I abode by your suggestions, and I am keeping Spinoza a little bit away from this in the moment. So what I bring today is the methodology part of my thesis, in which I try to measure and analyze social alienation by means of social representations. So in this regard, what I say, roughly speaking, and very brutally speaking, is that social alienation is quite a complex concept. So we needed to conceptualize it a little better so we can transform this into an analytical tool. So my idea, the overall objective of my PhD thesis is not the analysis itself, but it's the construction of a methodology capable of analyzing social alienation. And I stress the social part, right? Because we have alienation in several other fields with several other approaches, especially within psychology. Alienation is quite an individual symptom, right? So we are not dealing with this individualized symptom of alienation, but we're dealing with the social alienation as something that is collective, a collective phenomenon. And how will I do that? So first of all, alienation is the distance from a reference, right? This is how after all the reading and the reviews I did, alienation is usually the distance from a reference, and it happens in the imaginary, in the social imaginary, right? You can get Castoriadis' concept or the symbolics, right? The symbolic market, and it is constituted of social representations. So in this regard, we can measure social representations, but we cannot measure the imaginary. And the idea here is that the imaginary, what is or how it is, how people think and their attitudes and their opinions at a collective level, on a collective level, right? This is not measurable as the imaginary. But if you break it down into social representations, into something that is anchored and objectified, then you can systematize the content and the cognition of this imaginary. So the idea here is that the imaginary is far away from an archetype, an ideal reference, what should be or how it should be. The ideal type in Weber, right? The Weberian ideal type, the horizon. So you set an ideal. For example, if you take Marx's approach on alienation, Marx's concept of alienation, he is within the capitalist framework. So within the capitalist framework, the production is essential to man, to the species of man, to the man species. And this way of doing things into the capitalistic world distances the worker from another way of producing, from another process of natural production. So he produces systematically in an automated way. So there is this what it should be, what the worker should be, and how the worker should be producing, and how the worker is producing right now under this context and this structure. So in this regard, other approaches on alienation, they give you that supposed way of doing things. For example, you should socialize in a certain way. So if you don't, you're somehow alienated. You should have critical knowledge or know certain things. And if you don't, you are alienated. So alienation has come from this distance, from this reference. And the idea here is that this difference is between this reference and the social imaginary. So then social representations are the way we understand the world, and they give you shape of how we deal and understand the world. So we have the stereotypes and we have the archetypes that belong to our minds and belong to the processes of understanding and giving meaning to reality, right? So the idea here, Humberto, but alienation is much more than social representations. Indeed, it is. Alienation is much more complex. I could say, let me see the social representations of, I don't know, about nature and the environment. So I would set this sustainable way of thinking about man's actions upon nature, thinking about the Anthropocene, or thinking about sustainability, or thinking about the green economy, right? How to make things greener, right? And in the same idea, if I measure alienation, I will see that many people think that nature could be exploited and explored, and that man is intelligent enough to shape nature at their will, right, according to their needs. So natural resources will come into debate, and the idea here is that there will always be this distancing from this reference, this idea reference, and how people are behaving, their attitudes, their beliefs, and their opinions. So social alienation as social representation would be a collective phenomenon, right? And it's co-constructed always, so it's always transformable. It is always transformable, including the cognitive functions, because you need the cognition, you need these symbolic systems, so you can anchor. So from there, you create new knowledge, and you will process new information according to what you already know. So anchoring is turning what's not familiar into familiar by means of logic processes. This is all in the field of social psychology. So in this regard, alienation is a collective epistemic distancing from this referential mode, right? And my thesis will base itself on this tripod, this triple axis groundwork. It's social alienation regarding the community, alienation regarding nature, and alienation regarding knowledge. Because everywhere you read, and I think you all will agree, that we have lots of mentioning to human nature and the community as how can I say, a tighter social group in which their relations are of trust and not of interest. So we see lots of those debates, including these 3 points, right? So I collected them to transform them into the object, right? From which we are going to measure alienation by means of social representations. So I believe you remember this image. This is the collective imaginary, right? The collective imaginary. It processes social representations by means of image and also by means of discourse, of text, right? We have to systematize our thoughts into language so we can have them planned, projected, objectified, understood. So sometimes thoughts are just images that we need to translate into words. It may sound poetic, but it's psychology. So we have the social representations, which they are symbolic, totally symbolic. However, they base attitudes and behavior, right? They operate by means of logic. We already mentioned anchoring and familiarization. It's essentially epistemological. It's in the ideas, in the way people think. They are transformable. They are transferable. You can transfer this idea and these images and these concepts to other people, and they can be easier to be transformed, or they can have deeper roots and hardly transformed, more hardly transformed. Those social representations which do not transform that easy, they usually belong to the identity base, to the knowledge that creates the identity of that collectivity, of that social group. Just a moment. Very good. So social representations is about the social genesis and the ontogenesis of the symbolic reality, right? And it comprises the beliefs, which is defined in terms of what information can be assimilated and the existing knowledge that you have. You reorganize that knowledge, and then from beliefs you have behavior, which are like reactions to particular events. And then you have attitudes, and these attitudes, they become a pattern when they are institutionalized, right? And when we come to the collectivities theory, that I will explain why we're using the collectivities theory, the theory of subjective collectives, we are going to see that when the imaginary has certain attitudes institutionalized, we can see the plasticity and the aesthetics in which each collectivity can transform social reality. So they can transform and create institutions according to their own agreement, social agreement over time. And the word time is really important, because why do we research alienation anyways? Because if you think, and in my head, if I think about social transformation and transforming the world and making a nice impact onto the world, I will always consider the idea that people need to get closer to thinking what they should be thinking, or at least what science believes that people should be thinking. Science says that we should have sustainable attitude, that we should read more and always question what we read, especially in fake news and post-truth era that we are living, that we always have to question the news that we receive, or things that we should do to improve community actions, to help others, or at least to consider some sort of privilege in the world, and to see inequalities in a critical form. So all of those attitudes that people should be doing, for a greater good, this knowledge that it's objectified, that it's outside of us, and it's exactly this logic that we are going to implement as this reference, this ideal type. So when we have institutions, we have these social representations in an objective way, and they become harder to be transformed. So the collectivities they are social systems that can be analyzed, and they have subgroups inside, they have sub-collectivities, and usually they are based on identity borders. So inside one collectivity, you can have heterogeneous races and skin colors and ethnicities. You can have different people with diverse sexualities and gender. You can have immigrants, or you can have other types of communities. You can have leftists, and you can have right wing. So they can be heterogeneous in spite of being a collectivity, right? So the idea here is that the collectivities theory, together with social representations, they go beyond the social representation, and this theory and its variables are going to tell me who produces the knowledge they have, what is the size, or how many people, or what is the subgroup that commands, that tells other subgroups to think, who produces the social transformation inside this collectivity. Because then you go one step further, the social representations. Because if I'm talking about alienation, I cannot stop by simply systematizing symbols. I have to understand who creates and who produces those symbols, who produces that social representation inside the collectivity, and who is responsible for reiterating and reproducing these social representations. Is there a social transformation? Are the young individuals in this collectivity thinking traditionally, or are they thinking in the novel way? Because in that way we can really measure social transformation if youngers think different from old people inside a collectivity, especially if you think about intergenerational change, right? So the idea here is to check the centering and decentering. What is this? This tells me exactly not only about if it's homogeneous or not, but who produces the knowledge. Is this centered, or is this knowledge production, the social representations production, more democratized and decentered, or does this belong to everyone? The causality, does one subgroup has any more impact than the other inside the collectivity? What is the causality of this collectivity outside and upon themselves? The causality here is what causes both reiteration or change, right? And their consciousness of belonging to that collectivity. And then you have embedding and dis-embedding, which is the capacity for a subgroup to internalize and to become part of that mainstream social representation. So in a better way, we have the alienation, the distance between the current social creativity and imaginary, and that optimal mindset that I said, right? This ideal type. And I'm going to do it via questionnaire, by means of questionnaire. And this questionnaire has 3 parts, which I'm going to need as data, in order to achieve all that I want to achieve. The first part is the socioeconomic part, and that age is going to be an important factor. Age, occupation, I'm going to ask for gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity, general income, household income, and age, and this is it. The second section is, I am going to show you right now. Dunlap and his research friends, they came up with this questionnaire, right? They have 15 sentences, and this questionnaire really evaluates if people are thinking in the traditional way, what they call the dominant social paradigm, which includes all that ideas, those ideas that humans should explore nature, that natural resources are at human disposal, and that global warming is a media is lie, and people also who believe in plain earth, in flat earth, right? The and anyways, so this will measure how people are thinking in novel ways, in new ways, and the traditional ways. So the seven even numbered items, right? Um, the 2, the 4, the 6, the 8, the 10, they all mean to represent statements that are traditional, they are old. And all the odd items, the 8 odd items, they represent thinking regarding this new ecological paradigm, which is greener, more sustainable, more adequate to preserve nature in a certain way. So the idea is to take this very well established method regarding nature to employ that and check whether the collectivity in total think about nature, how they do it, if they think of nature more traditionally or in a more sustainable and contemporary way, let's say. And we also will get this data, and we're going to share by generations to see perhaps younger people, they are thinking more sustainably, whereas older people, older members of this collectivity, they are thinking more traditionally. So this supports, right, the idea that a social change is occurring, especially when it comes to the way we think the world, right? And I don't have it yet, but the idea is to transform these 15 statements related to nature, that we transform them into other 15 statements related to community and other 15 statements related to knowledge, reading and critical thinking and questioning information. And then we'll have these 45 statements, and we can do the same things for the other 2 axes that this research comprises: community, knowledge, and nature. And after that, we are going to use word association to elicit open questions. Okay, we have more pictures. It's a total of 12 pictures. This is the 3rd section of the questionnaire. And we're going to ask them, how do you feel about these images? How do you feel by looking at these images? And then the respondent will answer the way they want. And we are going to do word association. And this word association, and also the results from the 2nd section, all this data is going to be intersected and weaved, so we can get to answer all the variables that we want to answer. So first of all, we are going to see centering and decentering, which is the sociogenesis of symbolic reality. Who creates the symbols? What subgroup or what sub-collectivity inside the collectivity produces that? And for that, first of all, we are going to do multivariate lexical analysis. First of all, we are going to do a word count and word association. And then we are going to see which of these textual data corresponds to each other. And then we are going to see the proximities between these contents. So we can create dimensions and fields and to see not only how many people think the same, but what's the variance, the variation inside that collectivity. And for that, we're going to do a factor analysis, which corresponds to individual positions inside the collectivity for each representation. And then we are going to see their socioeconomic constitution only based on the categories of the socioeconomic questionnaire. And then we're going to do the representational constitution, which will come from those quantitative methods that I said above, because from these word associations, we can determine whether they are attitudes, whether they are well established, or whether they are beliefs, especially depending on the textual analysis and the meaning, the semantics analysis. And also we are going to systematize the social representations so we can go beyond that, right? So we are going to list the occurrences and the co-occurrences, which one occurs more and which one occurs the least. And from that, we are going to see the variation, right? And by means of a multivariate approach, we can see the levels of the subgroups, which subgroup impacts on each other. So we can see also power relations. For example, if one subgroup, they maintain this traditional way of thinking and they maintain certain stereotypes, and for a longer time, over more generations, we are going to see that this will have an impact if other subgroups different from that one are thinking alike, are thinking the same. So from that, we can really verify which subgroup influences the other, which one produces the knowledge, and which one's reiterate or reproduces the knowledge. Knowledge, I say it because there is lots of literature that talks about social representation as the basis of knowledge. And there is an entire field within social psychology that who really go for the social representations in order to measure not only knowledge, but also knowledge production, knowledge reiteration, and how to transform information to data, right? All this cognitive process. And then we're going to see the dispersion and the correlation of these symbols and also of the individuals according to an individual analysis. And from that, we have the causality, which is another variable, the power relations, as I have mentioned before. And we are going to do this multiple correspondence analysis, not only between the dimensions, but also between subgroups, right? There is this book, which is giving me a headache, that is called Quantitative Analysis for Social Representations. And it's a very interesting book, and they mention a lot these word associations and all these methods. So in this regard, when we talk about social transformation, we talk about the ability or the capacity of social systems, social groups to adhere or to reject certain types of thinking. So in this regard, if they have an embedding process, they are going to embody and they are going to accept certain traditional ways of thinking. If there is dis-embedding, they are going to get out and to extract themselves from this mainstream way of thinking. So when we see social transformation, as I said there, age as an indicator on the socioeconomic questionnaire, the section, and then we're going to see age as an indicator for this intergenerational transformation. So just to sum up, from the empiric to the theory, right? The method is going for the social representations because the social representations comprise the conform, constitute the social imaginary. And the alienation concept that I bring is that the imaginary, which is constituted by social representations, there is this distance from this way of thinking. So in this regard, we cannot measure per se alienation and the social imaginary, but we can tackle, right, what is the core constitution of social imaginary and creativity, which are the social representations. So from this method, I'm trying to achieve this general theory and to make it more empirical, to get out from the purely abstractness of the theoretical work. Nothing against the theory. I like the theory, but my idea is to make it more accessible, measurable, empirical, and to create a method for it. And I believe that the collectivities theory will allow us to go beyond the social representations and to really see the dynamics of information and knowledge inside the collectivity. And this is it for today. I don't know if I have used all my time, but thank you very much for listening. And that's it. Wait, yes.
Well, that was very succinct, but she certainly raised a lot of questions. It's an interesting approach to alienation. I didn't ask anyone if I could begin. I'm sorry. I just dove in and began talking. It's an interesting approach to alienation, measured as a distance between, current imaginaries, current level of creativities, and what you termed an optimal mindset. Just to get the conversation going, what might you have to say in a bit further detail about what you understand as an optimal mindset?
Oh, do you want me to reply now?
Whenever you wish.
Okay, this optimal mindset, in fact, would be this ideal type, the same idealized reference, from which we are going to see the distance of the current imaginary. This optimal mindset would come from scientific argumentation, well-established, how can I say, well-established events and facts, right? Things like things that people couldn't or can't question.
Okay. Those list of 15 points that you were going to, the pairs of points of view that are dynamically, diametrically opposed to each other. Now, you spoke of this general issue that you're presenting as, at its basis, something epistemological. In other words, and I understand that to mean that within the framework you've sketched out, that social imaginary, as you speak of it, social representations have the power to, shall we say, create meaning, control what people understand, control what people think things mean, what people feel things mean. But this issue of an optimal mindset introduces ethical elements into it as well. So it's not just epistemological, it also has a fundamental ethical, moral even, significance as well. And this complicates things a bit, doesn't it? Because of course, of course, when you start talking about values, people say, "Oh, those are just values, right? Those are just those aren't objective. Those are well, personal in some sense, or local, specific to a community or to a group." I'm not saying I disagree with anything that you were saying, but this issue of the ethical content, makes things a bit more tricky, makes things a bit more complicated. Wouldn't you say?
Okay. I think you opened my eye for this issue, which I hadn't thought. I'm going to ponder about it, to sleep lots of nights on it. And you're right. I believe that some words and some expressions, they do elicit some sort of ethical issue, of ethical nature. Nevertheless, I do believe that there are certain types of thought that have become exterior to all of us. And for example, we shouldn't question if the earth is round, or we shouldn't question that a purer air is going to improve our health and our breathing. So we shouldn't question certain types of truth. They are scientific based. There are certain types of truth. Perhaps I misused the word optimal, right? Perhaps I should have said idealized or ideal mindset, right? But indeed, you are totally right. I mean, and then people will ask which type of knowledge is better than the other, or which type of truth is more truth than the other, right? So I have to think about it.
I have
I see
comments
that.
to make, but they can wait because there's two other people who wish to speak as well. Hi, Nick. I didn't have a chance to meet you earlier, but please.
Maybe I'm not sure if I totally got everything right, and I don't know how far the discussion about alienation in general is already done here. So, but I'm puzzled a little bit, because alienation, as I understand it, is a concept where the distance is not distant to an ideal. It's a critique of a wrong identity. And the dissolvement of the alienation would be to find not the identity between the wrong identity and the false identity. It would be a different point with a different identity in a way. And so if one just says we measure alienation by a distance, then the identity, the lack of, then the critique of alienation becomes the critique that people are not well integrated enough. And according to my understanding, this is the totally opposite of what alienation, the critique of alienation is about. You understand what I mean? I mean, like, alienation is a wrong form of being integrated in a wrong society, right? So if we make the being not integrated well enough as the point of measurement, then we lose this dimension of the critique of alienation.
Interesting point of view, interesting approach. I believe this input is quite valuable. But the idea here is that we are talking about something that is collective, right? Even if I have this distance from this idealized reference, I will have inside the collectivity, I may have some sort of democratic way of producing knowledge. Or perhaps inside that collectivity, the reality, the intrinsic reality, which deals with the identity issue, inside that collectivity, they will have their own ways to process information and to produce new knowledge according to their own identity. That does not mean that they are not, how can I say, as you put, as the result of the alienation will be the wrong identity, the wrong way of being integrated. So if there is a wrong way of being integrated, I can always look from the other side of the coin and see why is there people integrating wrongly or misintegrating, right? And then we are going to get to the critique of alienation. In fact, the idea here is to precisely transform this critique of alienation inside something that can be empirically assessed and empirically seen, that people can see it in data, not only qualitative data of interviews, because I don't like socializing, or I don't see myself in my production, or I produce industry on an industrial level, so I don't have any sort of resemblance of who I am in the products that I do. Everything I am goes to the material world. We have these critique marks, but we also have other approaches which are more humanistic. For example, Dirk is going to agree. I read Reg better, and I also have my critiques on her, and about the human species, right, which is some sort of alienation that Marx also brought from our own nature. And some other people, they look only in that dimension to see alienation, but it's still, this is a distance from what many species should do, or how they should treat nature, or how they should plant a tree, or write a book, and all the types of expectations, right, that we have for people. I'm not saying that the critique is wrong. On the contrary, I'm just trying to give it another look, and I have to start from the methodology, because in fact, alienation is quite complex. This is why we are still debating here on RC36 alienation. But I'm going to look at it. I'm going to get your input, and if you have readings, please let me know, because I'll get your input to expand my debate in my PhD thesis, because it's really interesting.
Dirk, you had something to say?
First, I have to unmute myself, right? Okay. Thanks for the talk, Humberto. So it's interesting to try to catch, and you know, I think it's interesting to catch the phenomenon of alienation via quantitative or via psychosocial psychological tool. And I also think it's very interesting. It's interesting for some reasons. The first reason it's interesting for, first of all, we try to find who are the, now comes also the critique, the deviance in this system to measure. And I also think it's a difference. I also understand Heinrich right, and the collective. What I think here is what could be needed or could be done is to differentiate between anomie and also Durkheim, and also the concepts of alienation, meaning basing on concepts of having the right society, and you also can include Jaegi as a matter of fact, and other new so-called critical theorists in it, which thinks the society is not that bad, but the individual can make it better. So it's like to find out the enemy and contra the alienation concept of maybe critical theory, because coming to the idea that finding deviances and more or less logical or cognitive deviances also leaves behind the idea of the senses and the body. as a statics of senses. So you know that, and this goes a little bit in Andrew direction. People have a feeling what is right, and this you know that's true. That is the idea. The problem is when we talk about archetypes, for example. I think about Jung, for example, or others. So I also think about, is it right, and is it not the problem of this kind of mythological thing in it? So I would suggest putting in first Durkheim, anomy, and the concept of alienation. Then when you talk about the concepts of collective, I also would think it would be useful to work with Benjamin and Susan Buck-Morse, where she explains pretty good Benjamin's concept of the imaginaries for the thinking of the collective, the past and the future thinking, with respect also to maybe Jung. You also can have a little critique of Heidegger with that, because the problem here is that you have this kind of collective imaginaries growing and socialized via history, which also might be, and then I'm with Heinrich, might be very wrong as a matter of fact, and goes in the wrong direction. So the question is how, and this might be the question, how we can differentiate between the kinds of not alienated, reificated imaginaries and the right imaginaries, because they are also imaginaries. How to see what is non-identical, what is identical, in what senses. To see also, did I write it down? So that this, and change the optimal mindset and idealized mindset. I think that is a pretty good thing to do. Because the problem is also when we begin with the collective, we also have this kind, and this is also again Marx, there's a leading ideology as a Überbau, as a matter of fact, is doing this. And there is a problem also when we see, okay, how we can differentiate this. What I think is pretty good in your thinking is to not have just a leading ideology from the elites, but see who are the, especially in the age of social media, where is it coming from? Because and there we have maybe different kind of collectivities and logical, let's see, collectives, which are wrong and right. So it's a struggle of it. Makes it much more difficult than we have it in the old days, as a matter of fact, with only some books. So it makes it really, really interesting. But I think one thing is you have to point out why you only go after cognitive. Maybe you can, because you can't do everything. That's clearly sure. But say why it's so important, and why it's not all to bring in also the body, the senses, and try to combine it, because this is also a problem. And it also changes the matter of fact with social media, because they're also there you can argue for the cognitive, but we are humans. We have this kind of senses, and we rely on it, and we feel something. And this also is the kind of the human nature. You feel something. The question is, how is there, which is can only be socialized and not socialized. So just some suggestions coming through. Maybe I can formulate it a little bit better later. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant.
Yes, sir.
Brilliant.
Heinrich, you have something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Dirk said. I think, I mean, there is not an empirical quantitative approach to this, but Ernst Bloch, in a way, had the same idea in a way, right? But the social imaginary he was pointing to all through his work is the social utopia. It's like collective imaginary of a better world, starting from the daydream, starting to old myth and fairy tales and so on. And he was working all his life to dip into this pool of a certain kind of social imaginary, which he would argue was the sole base for a better world, right? And from there, one could measure alienation by putting utopia, or like the history of social utopia, and measuring alienation as a distance to this utopia. But in doing so, one today, after seeing the dialectic of enlightenment, right, one would also need to reflect the destruction of utopia, right? So this is why I'm not sure if this will work in a quantitative approach today, because there is no social utopia anywhere. In neoliberalistic capitalism, the utopia is destroyed. So one would, I have no idea how to conceptualize this in an empirical framework. I would rather choose a qualitative social research approach to this, to find residual structures of utopia or something. But this would, in a way, narrow the view on what kind of social imaginary one would need to look for. Okay, yeah.
I think this is an interesting way to establish, to support the quantitative findings. Because when you talk about utopia, I'm talking exactly about this reference, this Weberian ideal type that it's unattainable, that it's unreachable, but we try to do the best, we try to be our best, we try to think different, we try to change it, transform the world. So all this utopia that you said, that we have killed it, right? The structure has killed it, society has killed it in this capitalistic 21st century. But I believe this would be a very nice support, a qualitative support. I have to say I miss the qualitative analysis, but I believe that this quantitative effort is going, how can I say? Even though it will lose a little bit of this magic of the theoretical abstractness, the symbolic world of conceptualization, I believe that it can really establish some real data on power relations within collectivities, on knowledge production, on causality between collectivities and between social systems. And I believe it's going to be even a helpful way for sociology and for alienation researchers to have, how can I say, more empirical data to support any kind of qualitative or conceptualization, I guess. Because I haven't seen this other dynamic than this distance in Fromm, not even in Seaman, with his 6 dimensions of alienation. I haven't seen that in Hartmut Rosa. I haven't seen that in Haegi. I haven't seen anything different from that. They only set a context. They set, it can be epistemic, it can be material, it can be exterior, it can be immanent, it can be transcendent. It doesn't matter. They have the objective, and alienation is always someone who is far from the goal, from their object. Even in psychology, people who are alienated, parenting alienation. It's about a relationship different from the relationship that is expected, right? So they have this type of socialization that is expected. If you don't socialize in that way, this will show us a diagnosis of a symptom of you are alienated. If you are alienated regarding information, if you believe in fake news, for example, it's because you're far from having the cognitive process that is expected, the questioning behavior or attitude as it is expected to have critical thinking, right? So I haven't seen this, but of course I am always looking through from the other side, right? I'm always looking from the side that wants to transform all this theory into empirical work. And perhaps it's complex, but this theory is quite complex. Talking about alienation is complex, so the method couldn't be different from that.
Dirk, then Russell.
Yeah, I have to lower my hand, not my voice. Yeah. Well, I don't agree with Heinrich and with Humberto. As a matter of fact, I don't think that the utopian thinking is dead. I think it's still there. It's überwintert. So maybe also only in sarcasm, but also you see it in the when we come to Bloch in the not yet conscious, noch nicht Bewusstsein. So I think people feel uneasy, and you can, and this is also why people tend to go to the wrong parties or whatever. So it's because they feel it's not right, and there is something not right, but the analysis is a problem. I think also when we think about imaginaries, and so I'm a bit puzzled about would it be useful also to work with the concept of consciousness, societal consciousness and consciousness. This would be also open a little bit up. And also, I think it might be good to introduce or to play with it. You can also go away from it afterwards, but I think it might be important to point out subjective and objective truth. Is there a concept of subjective and objective truth? Because thinking about alienation, also pointing to Joachim Israel, is that the understanding of the reality. And if people don't have the right understanding of reality and have the kind of imaginaries, but they're not facing the reality, which is objective,
Exactly.
then you also can talk about difference, maybe. But it has nothing to do what other people are thinking, because this is an intersubjective approach, which Habermas and also with Honneth and so on. So if everything is thinking that is right, that does not make it right. It can be wrong anyhow. Who cares about what everyone is thinking? There is an objective truth, and there is a truth, maybe an intersubjective truth and a subjective truth. But intersubjectiveness makes nothing objective. And then we have the question about what is objective truth and so forth. Maybe Horkheimer gives some notions to us. But I don't think you have to go this direction, but you might think about and maybe discuss it, and maybe you go with it or you just throw it away. That's your decision. But you have to work maybe through it and think about it.
This is very interesting. Very interesting. I'm writing down.
Ursula, do you have something to say?
If Humberto wants to continue this line of thought, so maybe
I can't hear
You
you
have to
very well.
unmute you.
Get closer to the mic.
You have to unmute you. You have, yeah. No.
I have too many mics here. Okay, so if Humberto, if Heine has something that is in this line of thought discussion, so maybe it could be next and then me. Do you hear anything? No.
Speak louder.
Louder?
Yeah.
Do you hear?
Now.
Yes.
So, okay, so perhaps it's not this microphone. It's I have 3-4, so I don't know where it sounds. Okay, if Heine has something that is related to this kind of line of discussion here, this thought, so maybe you can continue and then I will say something, because it may be a little bit in a different direction.
Okay.
I just have one thought about the question of utopia and the social imaginary, because you were making the point that believing in conspiracy theories and so on would be a sign of a certain type of alienation. I mean, truth, empathic truth, probably is one of the oldest social imaginary, right? The idea that truth is adequatio rei et intellectus, is that concept and object come together in a way, is a certain form of utopia, right? And that people behave and organize their thought process, their arguments in a way that this doesn't count anymore, certainly would count as a form of alienation. But I would argue that the construction of what the theoretical, what the social imaginary is from which the distance then is measured, would need a theoretical discussion in your paper, because you can't. And this is what I was thinking when I was hearing your I heard your presentation the first time, that finding those concepts, it's the social imaginary from which distance is measured itself would be a positivistic approach to it, because you can't just take some discourses and say they are now the social imaginary we are measuring the distance from. One would need a approach in a way which uses the history of philosophy or something like this, or as I would argue, the history of social utopia to measure it from. Yeah, that's it.
It's brilliant. What you said is brilliant. You think we shouldn't measure the other way around, to start measuring from the idealized idea and not from the collectivity itself, because actually what is truth and what is not, I totally agree to that. And when you read about alienation, you read a lot about doxa and epistemic and all these Platonic ways of conceiving reality by means of ideas, and what is utopian, what is not, what is dystopian, what is not. Within psychology, we have the stereotype, which is on individual level, the archetype, which is on cultural level, and we have the prototype. And the prototype is that which is exterior to you, is a truth that will exist regardless if you're alive or not. It's a truth that already lives outside of us, that it's transcendent, it's not immanent. So inside psychology, we have those truths that are immanent to us, and we are lucky if our immanent truths are adequate to these external truths, right? Otherwise, there is a dissociation between reality and what we believe. In fact, there is this whole debate about mythology and theocracy inside psychology, right? So the idea here is that there is this truth that Bourdieu called the objective capital, right? That truth that is external to us, that production that is external to us. If there is a truth, or if in the future they're going to find a more well-established truth which is better than that one, they are going to replace that. It's going to be replaced. There will be a process of replacing that, right? But that does not diminish the fact that each collectivity will understand that truth in a particular way. Each collectivity will share a set of images or discourses to interpret that reality and that truth, right? So the idea here is not to give a moral judgment on how far they are from this ideal. It's not to put like, oh my God, you are far from sustainability, so you're wrong, ha 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 ha. As I said, there is no right or wrong. The idea here is that how they produce that social representation. What do we need for a social transformation? You need to change heads. You need to change ideas. You need to change epistemologically. So in that regard, is the social transformation ongoing? Is it occurring? Are the newest generations thinking differently? Do any subgroup influence the other? So this is all entitles the process of alienation, because it is a social and collective phenomenon. So this all entails in understanding better the alienation process. I know that when we talk about truth and idealized way of thinking, we always tend to include, I believe that Andrew also said about this ethical and moral way, what is truth, who sets the truth. and who sets this ideal pattern, this ideal way. But I believe that it's our role as scientists also to review literature and to revise and to get multiple approaches and multiple ways of thinking and looking at a certain object. And so we can extract some general idea from this. I believe this is part of what we're doing here. And I believe that we have been trying to conceive several approaches as antagonistic, when actually one can help the other to explore and get closer to an object. So I'm not here to say that any approach on alienation is wrong, but that all approaches that I've seen, they really deal with an idealized type or set of behavior or context or structure, an idealized structure in which certain types of behavior wouldn't exist, right? So in this regard, what I'm trying to do, as I said, is more methodological than theoretical. It's really trying to analyze and assess quantitatively this distance and this relationship to a certain type of thought. And then you can apply to anything. People have done research on alienation regarding work. If the person is aware and conscious of work rights and labor rights, other people have done alienation regarding health-related issues, right? About HIV, about cancer. Other people have done how you are alienated inside the school, inside the classroom, and alienation from their peers and colleagues. If the alienation is structural, if the alienation is subjective, if it's internal, external, immanent, transcendent, subjective, objective. So the idea here is to combine all those approaches and not to say that one diminishes the other, because I believe that each one will deal with a certain aspect of something so complex as alienation is. And that's the idea. So I'm trying to make it simpler, but I cannot run away from certain debates and limitations, of course. I will always find certain limitations. But I believe that by adding all approaches, I'm going to get a better result.
I have a comment, but I'd like to begin with a very small question first. One of the names you mentioned as you began your presentation is Jose Mauricio Dominguez.
Yes.
That's a new name to me. I don't know much about intellectual life in South America, in Spanish and Portuguese, I'm afraid. Could you tell me a couple of words about Dominguez?
Yes, of
Where
course.
he comes from.
He's got plenty of literature in English. Actually, most of his work is in English, and he spent half a year teaching in Berlin at I believe it's Freie University. I don't know which university he works. He has this theory about political modernity, and in 1992 he issued his first scheme of the subjective collectivities theory, and he uses the imaginary to talk about the collectivity in a way to bridge the individual and the social aspect of life. And he works with the institutionalization of the imaginary and how certain symbols in the imaginary are institutionalized, which is something that I brought here to this research. And he also gives certain ideas of what a collectivity is, if it's institutionalized or if it isn't. So he deals with this. I believe he's easier to understand than I don't know, the social systems or other types of social grouping general theories. But the most important about his idea are those variables about centering, decentering, embedding, disembedding. And because in that way, he tries to theoretically explain how social transformation occurs or reiteration occurs, if it doesn't or it does. So I find it very appealing. And also, he's even though he's got many books, I believe he publishes one book a year. He's very prolific, but he's also my advisor, so I have to talk about. So there is this politics involved, but I have always I had read him before I get into my PhD. When I was in my master's, I read him because he is one of the greatest sociologists, contemporary sociologists in Brazil, and he's also from the Institute of Social and Political Studies, and there is this book of his which is amazing, Political Modernity and Critical Theory.
Mhm.
And his theory is all about modernity, and now he is engaging in the eco-sociology and ecological thinking and planetary limits, the Anthropocene, and all these nature-related stuff. What is something very, very new to him at this moment. So I get his theory just to surpass and to cross the social representations, to go further and beyond in the collectivity. So I think it's very useful to explain. I will send you some of his work.
Okay.
I have it here.
Vasila, did you have a comment?
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, I think Humberto, it was a very, very good presentation. And I really find your project very fascinating. And it reminds me some previous discussions in this committee about whether or not we should just stick to the classical theory of alienation, or we should try to develop it in different directions. And of course, there was an old school, so to say, that said that no, we should not touch it. It's said already what it was, and it should be not developed in any direction whatsoever. And we were pushing a little bit towards the involvement of further understandings or that have some sociological relevance. And I think that almost, I was convinced that perhaps there are two different discourses on alienation, and there is something like macro sociological and micro sociological discourse. And it seems to me that you're here in the micro sociological discourse more. But of course, Dirk, had a very nice suggestion, that you also start with Durkheim and, start with Anomy and so on and so forth. But so we should not forget that really in sociology, we also have a social psychology that has nothing to do, not exactly, but it's not the psychological tradition. It's not Fromm, it's not Erikson, it's not Freud, but it's Mead and Cooley. And here I come to another point. I found this very interesting that you began talking about Moscovici. And I had some occasion to first encounter him in a kind of strange situation, which I saw a whole group of very, very inspired people who were talking about Moscovici. And then I, for the first time, heard about him. But I was not convinced that really, it was so useful for sociology as these people were talking about. But then I contributed to a book on Charles Horton Cooley, and this is micro-sociology proper in sociology. And the book is called Updating, I can show it to you, Updating Charles Horton Cooley. Okay, and here in this wonderful book, in which also I have an article, perhaps the biggest expert on Cooley, and this is Glenn Jacobs, he has an article, The Dilemma of Social Representation Theory, how Cooley's sociology provides a game plan for their resolution. And basically, he here exactly is trying to adopt, in a sense, Moscovici in sociology, because he's more, I mean, he's not exactly a phenomenologist, but he's a kind of, the French school, but somehow in the periphery. So he was neglected, almost one of those forgotten scholars. And when we tried to retrieve Cooley with this book, actually, Glenn Jacobs said that we have to retrieve him, but also there are other people who have to be retrieved, and this was Moscovici. And so he tried to say that, I mean, the idea, that's why it's fascinating that you're going back to the idea of imagination. And I think that really, if you also include Cooley, because then you really will be on sociological ground. This is classical sociology. And Cooley, I think, was misunderstood, and me himself misunderstood him. So this was my point here in the book. And there were also a lot of other people who think that he was misunderstood, because Cooley was the first sociologist to talk about imagination. And he was so Glenn Jacobs before that had a wonderful book about Cooley, imagining the social world, I think was, but this was about imagination, and Cooley was the person who introduced this. So the point is that really we didn't, theorize a little bit more, this concept, and imagination somehow was, left on the background. But Cooley was talking about exactly the uniting of the objective and the subjective in the mind through imagination. And so for Cooley, things that do not have representations in the mind, so the things that we cannot imagine, they don't exist. And then he was accused, of solipsism, and then he was just, discriminated against. I would say he was forgotten because he was a bad philosopher. But actually, we misunderstood Cooley, and because sociology did not develop into that direction, so he's, so to say, a forgotten sociologist himself, who had, a few good concepts. So I think that you can revisit Cooley a little bit, or perhaps, take this article, and see how, because the idea is that Cooley solves the problems in Moscovici. Moscovici was thinking about this game, but what Moscovici couldn't do, Cooley has done already in sociology. And I think that, this can put your position in a more steady ground. And also, I think it's a wonderful idea when we write something to really find something useful from the past that is a little bit forgotten, to shine it a little bit and to, make it useful again. So my question to you is, did I if I understood properly what you say, so can we just make a conclusion that actually what you're implying is that if you do not have imagination, you are alienated. And if you cannot imagine the future, you are alienated in a social psychological sense. Because when the worker is, producing something, the point is that he cannot imagine the future. He cannot imagine the future of the product that he produces, because this is not, his, so to say, a project. This is a very interesting idea of alienation. I really like it a lot. If you cannot imagine your future, you are alienated. Because you have to imagine yourself, from yourself, because you have to imagine yourself, in the future, in the past, so this is what you are, you're kind of creature who are situated in time. So if you cannot imagine that something has a future, what is that? Do you think that, we can interpret in this way, what you're saying about the imagination?
I believe that this is entirely what this research is about, because if you consider, for example, that you need certain types of social representations, you need certain symbolics, you need a certain systematization of ideas in your imaginary so you can think of the future. First, you are setting the ability and capacity of thinking about the future as your reference. And those who cannot think about the future are distant from this reference.
Yeah.
So the idea also applies here. And in this sense, you can only create knowledge from previous existing knowledge. You cannot create knowledge if the new information does not reside or is not fundamented on something that is familiar to you. Because for you to turn the unfamiliar into familiar, you have to use what you already know. You have to get a current knowledge so you can produce new ones. This is psychology. This is cognitive psychology. This is social psychology. Most of the books I've read this year are about social psychology, right? In this area. So thinking about the future is one of the symptoms of a good way of thinking, of a sustainable way of thinking. And this is a mode of thinking, a reference from which one can measure certain types of alienation or perhaps an indicator of alienation, right? So what psychology does, what the medical sciences do, they set a reference. The reference is for you to be healthy. The reference is for you to think properly, so you don't have any mental illnesses, so you don't have any mental disruptions, so your cognition can work just fine, right? And then you set these references from which you diagnose people, all the rest. So what I'm doing here is to sociologically transform that. Dirk, did you have your hands?
Yeah, when I think about future and I'm thinking about the future and can imagine oneself in the future, I think about not future, I think about self-realization because we're thinking in processes. So I would think about more in I have I think it's a good idea to get the future in it, but also to not to see the dialectic between the past, the present, and the future, and this in the process of self-realization. When you go in these processes, then it makes sense for me. So it's like if one can imagine oneself in the future, it thinks about the thinking that some animals can't think themselves in the future, and that makes our species, where you are back to the what is a human species. But the kind of processes thinking would be also interesting. Where is the processes? But surely I'm coming from a background where alienation and verification is only thought in a dialectical way. So that might be also difficult for me to understand other approaches which deal with this concept in a totally different way. But I would think about this kind of processes and would think about this kind of self-realization. So future with respect to myself is how can I realize myself? How can I see myself in what kind of environment or whatever, or collective? How can I see a collective self-realization? But I'm also a little suspicious always about collectives and self-realization. There is also a kind of, a good friend of mine, Ichai Landau, I write it in the chat. He wrote a book about messes and fascism. And I guess there one can see it might be the problem with the collective, where he puts also, and he's a very good Marxist, but also good critique of Marx and especially of critical theory.
What's his name?
Ichai Landau. He's at the Free University of Tel Aviv. The Open University of Tel Aviv. He has also written some books of really good critique of him.
Brilliant. I'll take a look into.
So because with the messes, it might be interesting. So I always get suspicious with messes because maybe I don't like messes, but also because if I see the hysteria going on today and which also in the past, it's for me more or less a sign of truth if the masses are not doing this. So instead of, but this is surely just saying so also naive. But
Heinrich maybe had something.
Yes.
Just to add to this discussion, in the materialistic theory of development von Alfred Lorenzer, there is this idea that the connectedness between the structure of sensuality and language it creates consciousness, and the unconscious and the unconscious imaginary is something which is there, which is still driving the imaginary, but it can't come through in a way. So this also would be maybe not a measurement, because it's not applicable to quantitative research, because it's psychoanalytic approach. But there you would have a concept of the imaginary, which can show if it's imaginary which can be transformed into language, or social imaginary which drives the imaginary from behind in a way. So maybe this could be interesting for your research. But yeah.
Two comments about imagination. First of all, Vesla, you remind me of this. Marcuse says in a very straightforward fashion, there can be no social change if you cannot imagine that there can be a social change. And on a somewhat related, but on a somewhat different level, Kant is known for the critique of pure reason, for example, right? However, the power of the mind, the power of the human body, the power of human being, right, that makes the mind work is the imagination. The third critique is not read nearly as much as the first or even the second. But straightforwardly, in a direct fashion, Kant says in the third critique that it is the power of the imagination which makes the structure of pure reason operate. Right? It's not just the power of judgment, as it is sometimes taken to be, right? But the machinery is driven by the power of the imagination. You can have a structure of categories, you can have the structure of pure reason, but none of it works unless it's driven by the imagination. And so this gives the imagination a very interesting role in cognition, right? Certainly gives the imagination a very interesting role in the second critique as well, in the questions of ethics and morality. It's often discussed in other kinds of ways, but I don't think there is as much discussion as there should be on Kant's notion that the mind doesn't work. There is no consciousness, there is no language, there is no perception without the imagination. It makes it all work. Now, that's not a question, but just a comment. Kant makes a strong remarks in that respect as well.
Yes, but the idea is not that they will not have the imagination, the imaginary. The idea is their imaginary will work according to the symbolic tools they have, right? So if the imaginary does not have the symbolic tools to think about the future, to think about social transformation, as yourself said, right, then it won't. They will still have an imaginary, but we're working according to the tools they have, to the representations they hold, to how they interpret the world and what cognitive functions they have. So it's intrinsic to certain types of collectivities. But we know that inside the collectivities, we also have those subgroups or sub-collectivities or subsystems, right, which act upon the other. Some subgroups, they have a higher impact in the overall mindset, in the general mindset, than other subgroups. Glenn Jacobs.
Of course, you can imagine in more than one way. Unless you define it, unless you specify it in more particular ways, you end up in something like, it reminds me of Heidegger talks about, standing in the light, and having, your mind filled by the light, having your being filled, by the light that comes down, and so on and so on. Yeah, sure. But anybody can go out there and stand in the light. Anybody can walk into the opening, the meadow in the middle of the forest, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that something good happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that something worthwhile happens, but it happens. Okay, and you can't say much more than that. Talking about utopias, right? They're talking about ideal types. Not all ideal types, not all. I think someone, I can't remember who it was, perhaps it was Heinrich, spoke of, having a dream about what the good would be, right? We can have nightmares about what the good could be as well, right? There are other things that have to be factored into the discussion before there's something that is ethical, worthwhile. We can know things that are worthwhile knowing. We can know things that are better not to be known, right? So it's not quite it's an open question. By the way, the first utopia, if you wish to call it that, is Plato's Republic, right? The Republican discussion of justice, right? But the discussion of justice never ends, right?
No.
It's a dialectical concept, right? It changes all the time. So good things can happen, bad things can happen, and it can be called justice.
That's true.
Enough of that.
Humberto, may I ask you, how did you come to Moscovici? This is a very strange name. Not everybody knows about him. There was a resistance in sociology even to accept that he will be in the book, together with other contributions. And it's a kind of phenomenological, perhaps, celebrity. But there is a strong tradition, I think, of between the Brazilian and the French sociology, and perhaps also psychology. Isn't it the case? Traditionally, Comte was very popular in Brazil, right?
Actually, social representation theory is very popular in Latin America as a whole. Especially in the field of education and in the field of health, how people represent and understand certain types of illnesses, how students see education or social representations from teachers and school managers. It's very common in Brazil to use social representations, and Moscovici is like, let's say, the forefather of social representation.
Yeah, he is the one. Yeah.
But of course, we always regard how the social representation theory has been developed over the years, because what I think is cool about social representation is that you can manage and adapt to your needs. So you have several methods from which you can absorb the data, acquire the data. You have word association, questionnaires, focus groups, interviews, and within these questionnaires and the word associations, you can use images, you can use pre-given list of words and ask people to associate them. And then when you find more literature, you see that there is an entire population of social psychologists who use social representation to assess cognition, because cognition, since Piaget, is something very hard to measure, especially when you talk about knowledge, because we have several types of different knowledges, if we can call it like that. We have the material knowledge, the functional knowledge, epistemic knowledge. So no type of knowledge is better than the other. We have already learned that in sociology of education and sociology of knowledge. But the idea here is that Moscovici is a little bit outcast. He's an outcast in sociology, especially because all his findings, sociologists tend to think it's too psychological for a sociologist. And I don't buy that. I believe we are social psychologists all the time, whether we are talking about a structure, whether we are being constructivist, whether we are being materialistic, whether we are being abstractionist. I don't know, from Foucault to Marx, okay, and all the debates in between. I believe that we deal with the social aspect of the individual psychology all the time.
Yes.
And
okay, yeah, it's finished. I will say something.
no, please. I have finished.
Yeah, this is something that I deal with in the moment. I try to solve something that is more than 100 years old problem in sociology and in social sciences, that there is no communication between the social psychology in psychology and the social psychology in sociology.
I agree.
And this is a huge problem. Nobody can fix it. Parsons was trying to fix it. You know, his actually social theory was exactly meant to do this, and he collected the necessary people, but it's not just have the people, you have to, you know, integrate the perspectives, and it has never been done. So when you say we all are social psychologists, yeah, I believe, but what kind of social psychologists you are? Because these people, you know, in psychology, they have absolutely different perspectives. And so I'm trying now to negotiate something with the psychologists. It's really very difficult because, first of all, they can believe that human personality cannot be changed after 18 years of age because it's unchangeable. You know, you have some kind of, you know, processing, interaction, yeah, at the beginning, and then that's it, you know. And I think that in sociology, it's very important to believe that there is a future, you know, that you can change. Even a criminal can be changed, you know, that this society has an opportunity to, you know, recreate itself, you know, so it's not just everything is lost. So we are very optimistic. We believe in the future, in a sense. So we don't want to alienate it, you know, from the future. We are very positively thinking people. But the psychologists, you know, basically they're, yeah, but the psychologists, I mean, honestly said, you know, it's about the personality and the self, you know, so he talks about the self, you know, he takes it from Freud and, you know, changes it a little bit, but basically we think that this is a sociological theory and this is social behaviorism, but we talk about interaction instead of behavior. But the psychologists think that there is no such thing. You do not have the right to touch even this theory. It's a personality and the self is part of it. There is nothing beyond this personality theory. So it's really a tricky thing. So you have to be careful here. But you have to say social psychology because I think that what you're doing here, you know, it should be said that this is alienation theory somehow, you know, a little bit reoriented, you know, because it's very micro. You know, you're using methods here that, you know, you can really produce some kind of note. It's very abstract, but at the same time, it's measurable. So it's, yeah, but mention the word social psychology, but don't say that this is the only thing that is possible because some people think that we should not have social psychology because this is not psychology. Among other things, I very often I hear my colleagues who say that I talk about social psychology and they say, no, this is the Department of Sociology. You cannot talk about psychology here. That's a reality.
I
believe this. Yeah.
I'm very sorry, but I have to leave because I have a other colloquium in 15 minutes, and yeah.
It's exactly the time for everybody to leave, right?
Yes. We have achieved.
It was nice that you could join us, Heinrich, and looking forward to meeting you again.
Nice
So
to hear you.
yeah, please keep us company if you have the chance.
Come again, yeah.
Is it always the same